wanted to do something to honor coastal cowboys, past, present, and the future. And so I'm going to ask Bob Kaler here to give us one of his cowboy poems. I'll let him give you the title of it, and you'll understand why we chose it.
What it takes to be a cowboy ain't a pair of faded jeans or dusty hat or western boots all busted at the seams. It ain't his looks or what he wears, it's in his heart and mind. His manners, they are gracious, and his ways are mostly kind. His smile is quick, his voice is soft. He's got a gentle way. With children and with animals, he meets a long life's way. Tips his hat or gives a nod to ladies that he meets. An outstretched hand he offers to each gentleman he greets. He's firm in his convictions. He's quick to lend a hand. With justice and with righteousness, he always takes a stand. To those about in need of help, his hand is never slow. Never boasts, never brags, never makes a show. To think of life without him would make me mighty sad. The reason is, you see, this cowboy's my dad. I was hauling horses over to Dayton to the vet's office, and I wrote that poem on the way.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. All right, and I wanted to draw your attention to the Coastal Cowboys panel discussion flyer that you received. And on that front page, you'll see that photograph. Well, in that photograph, you will see members of the Boyd ranching family. And we have 4 brothers here tonight, all in this photograph. And one of them is on our panel right here, Lloyd Maxwell. And Lloyd, would you introduce your 3 brothers to us, please?
My brother David is sitting right there in what kind of shirt it is, kind of bluish pink, blue, purple. My brother Arthur is the next one, and my brother Don on the far end. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. So we're going to get right into this thing. If you'll look at your pamphlet there at the bios of these gentlemen, we could write a book about each one of the 3 without exaggeration. So we wrote up this little short write-up. I'm going to give you just a brief touch on it, and then I'm going to let them expound a little bit on how their families got here and how they started into this ranching lifestyle and kept their families going over these years. Bob's family come from a cattle ranching background, did some rodeo producing. Bob was a real fair saddle bronc rider himself and a rodeo producer also. He's written 5 books, by the way, and I like one line about Bob. He said that cowboys don't have to be illiterate. And that really grabbed my attention because one of the first guys I worked with when I was a young man had a PhD. And I didn't even know what that meant, but I was wondering what in the world he was doing out there. There you go. So, Bob, I'm going to let you finish off that. Give us just a little background about your family and how they got started in cattle ranching.
Okay, my great-grandpa was born on the beach here at Bolivar. His father had scarlet fever and died on the beach, and his mother married a Beckstroff. But that was how it got started. And my great-grandpa had a cattle, and he lost a herd of 1,500 head in the 1900 storm. And then in the 15 storm, he lost 1,500 more. And he said if he lived long enough, he'd have another herd. But that's pretty rough country. But my grandpa moved after riding in the attic of a house during the 1900 storm, while the house was floated 2 miles, he moved to Stowell, and he'd bring his cattle out from the saltgrass to Stowell every year at hurricane season. He didn't like that. And that's just kind of how we got started in this area.
All right, great. Thank you, Bob. The next on your program there is Lloyd Maxwell. We've already introduced him once, but we'll introduce him again. And Lloyd family got here way back in the early days, and his grandfather, Boyd, built one of the largest ranching empires, covered 4 counties at one time in southeast Texas. So I'm going to let Lloyd tell you a little bit about his family and how they got started.
My grandpa Boyd was born in Mississippi in 1876. And he lived in a little town in Calhoun County. And Grandpa Boyd and his mother passed away. His father passed away in 1884. So his mother was left as a widow with five kids. And she had never been out of the county, and she decided that they were broke. The boys couldn't pick enough cotton to make survive anything. They didn't have anything to live for. And she wanted to move, but she didn't know where to go. So some of the kids got together. They were just teenagers, and they talked to some of the neighbors, and somebody gave Uncle Cap, who was their oldest son, and he was about 12 years old then, they told him, said, y'all need to go to Texas. So great-grandmother Boyd decided that Texas might be the best thing because I don't have anything here to live for except my kids. So they arranged to get a train ticket. And she took a train ticket and headed to Beeville, Texas, and was told, when you get to Beeville, Texas, contact Captain Jones of the Texas Rangers, and he'll take care of you. So here she goes, and she got on the train, and they headed towards Texas. And she'd never been out of the county she lived in. Grandpa said that he was just a teenager, but when they went across that big river, Grandpa said, Lord, when I get to Texas, I want to be made a cowboy. I want to be a cowboy. If you answer this prayer, that's what I want. So he took that train, they got to Beeville, Texas. When they got there, I'm sure that great-grandmother looked out the window and saw nothing but sagebrush and the railroad track had ended and just a few things around there. Said, what in the world am I doing here? And they met Captain Jones, and he was one of the nicest guys. He was a Texas Ranger. And he told her, says, we've been in the draft for about a year. Things aren't looking too good around here, but he says, I will help y'all any way we can. So he did. He helped Grandmother Boyd any way that she needed, and he got the kids small jobs and to-dos to run the place around there and run chores, and all you can do with kids, what do you do out there in Texas Rangers and some animals around there? So he got them to feed the animals and take care of them, and this went on for about 6 or 7 months, and he finally walked over to great-grandmother and says, Miss Boyd, I'm going to tell you, this looks like it's not going to get any better, but I want to do what I can to help you. I'm going to get you a wagon train, and if things are better in Matagorda, and when you get to Matagorda, you contact Captain Clear of the Texas Rangers. And he's in better shape right now than we are. So we they loaded up with what they had, which wasn't much. Got on the wagon train, and they went to Matagorda, Texas. When they got there, they unloaded, and Captain Clear was good to his word. So he went over and saw his local cowboy, Shanghai Pierce. And he got jobs for Grandpa and Uncle Will. They were big strapping boys. And he got the jobs with Shanghai. They were doing chores for Shanghai, and they both could ride. So Shanghai let them do whatever they could around his place to feed the horses, take care of them, make sure they learned how to ride good. And then they got to make 1 or 2 drives with Shanghai Pierce. I'm not sure how far they went, but they did make a couple of drives with him. And they were there for about 1.5 years or almost 2 years with Shanghai Pierce. Grandmother Boyd, great-grandmother, she wound up being the head cook and did all kinds of chores around the place. And Uncle Cap and Aunt Leila, the daughter, and Aunt Leila was the baby. And she was about 10 years old then. So they were doing pretty darn well. But that drought followed them probably all the way from Beeville to Matagorda. It finally hit them over there. So they decided, Captain Clear says, I'm going to do y'all a favor. I'm going to put you on another wagon train, and y'all head towards Houston. He said, you can probably get some relief over there because this isn't looking good right now. So they went straight on over, and they stopped at Old and Lost River. And they ran across Mr. Elmer Barber. And Mr. Barber at Barber's Hill.
I'm going to get you to hold some of that. We're going to ask you about it in a minute. Yeah, I,
I'm sorry.
don't blame me. I'm watching the clock down
Oh,
here.
I'm ready. I'm ready. Time
Yeah.
out.
Okay. All right. So I'm sorry. You did good. All right. Thank you, buddy. I'm sorry. I got to be careful about that. He's bigger than I am. So, and he's got his three brothers with him too. So, hey, before I introduce Dave Scott, I just noticed that Gerald Sullivan walked in. And Gerald, would you stand up just a second? We gave you a round of applause earlier, but now we can do it for real. Thank you. Thank you for coming. And the man to my left, Dave Scott. Dave, like I said, you just write a book about these guys. So Dave, family part of the old original 300 colonists that got here in the old days. They've been a cattle ranching family for many, many years and still are. And in fact, he still runs cattle on the George Ranch over in Richmond, Texas. And Smokey just got through working at the George Ranch today and hightailed it over here to get here to entertain y'all. So we've got a lot of connections going on here. But Dave, to cut my presentation short, been a past president of the Texas and Southwestern Cattle Raisers Association, and he's also inducted into the Texas Cowboy Hall of Fame. So I'm going to let him.
Well, I was president of Cattle Raiders, and I was well known for giving shorts. I'll give you one tonight. My family came here in the early 1830s, and they settled on right on the ship channel, but it's a river there. Cedar Bow. Yeah, Cedar Bow, but the river is now the ship channel. If you go over the Hartman Bridge, you can look over there at the Exxon tank farm down there, and that was called Point Pleasant, and that's where they lived. He had 2 sailing schooners, and he traded between there, New Orleans, Veracruz, and then Tampico. And he had cattle. I forgot how many kids he had, but anyhow, my grandfather was born over in Liberty County, and he came to Houston and went to work in Fort Bend County and was running a ranch over there. And he got to trading a little bit and got some pretty good credit. And so he got in the cattle business. He was the only one that was really in the cattle business in a big way. And I'm going to tell you a story. He made a deal with John Jackson over in Anahuac, put cattle over there on their ranch. And this was about 1914. And I don't know how many he had. I guess all he could pay for. But anyhow, they told him it. And people from Anahuac know 1985, that house, well, that was their headquarters. And there was an old Frenchman, which I never could find out which one it was, because there's a bunch of them over there. But anyhow, he told my granddad, said, you don't have anything to worry about. Water said 1900. Water did not get up here. And so anyhow, he was in Houston. He couldn't leave. Storm was coming. And when he did get down there, well, the house was gone. Cattle had all drowned, and the Frenchman was gone. So that was one of his first setbacks. And he kind of recovered from that. And they got 4 of them formed a partnership, B.S.&M Cattle Company. And they ran cattle South Texas and around Chambers County and a lot of cattle around Alvin and Arcola. And anyhow, they had most of the cattle down on the salt grass below Hitchcock. And the 1924 freeze came, and he was a senior in high school, and he always told me about the freezes because he was in high school. It was Christmas holidays, and all those cattle froze down on the bay, and they didn't really freeze. They would walk out in the water because the water was warmer than, I think it was 5 above or something, for 3 or 4 days. And they'd walk out in the water and they died from hypothermia, washed back up on the beach. And you could walk from Causeway all the way around West Bay and never step on the ground with cattle. So he spent all his Christmas holiday on their skin and cattle till it warm, and then that was the end of it. And I'll quit there.
Thank you, Dave. That was great. So one of the things we don't want to leave out when we talk about cattle ranching and cowboys is the horses. And I grew up a young man. I was always a horse-thinking type guy instead of a cow-thinking type guy. And cut me out a pretty good little living there on the side, training the horses and knowing how to see a good one and work a good one and make a good ranch horse out of them. So Bob Kayla is also a very skilled horseman, and he's had not only himself but his son. Son won a world championship in cutting. Is that right? Yeah, it sure did. Yeah. So Bob, why don't you tell us about a few of the horses that you might remember that are noteworthy in your book?
Handoff Club, who was working for the Boys, said when they drove the cattle down to the saltgrass from from higher up here, like they drive them down the saltgrass, that my grandpa had the first real cutting horse that he ever saw, the old Dunmare. And so I grew up admiring good horses. And my daddy always liked a good horse. And he was good with a horse. And I think I was fairly decent with him. I broke and trained about 4,000 of them. I know that everybody loves their own horse, but Pepe's Quattro was a horse that I loved. When he was 23 years old, my son rode him and qualified for the high school national finals, and we hauled him all the way to Wyoming, Gillette, Wyoming, and he was dancing out of the trailer when he came out. And then the next year we went to Springfield, Illinois, and I'll tell you how tough that horse was. He was straight off the King Ranch. He set a record for the highest selling horse at the King Ranch sale, and he was a great horse. And he went to, and Luke rode him at the high school finals in Springfield, and then we drove all the way straight back, taking turns driving, back to Crockett. And we entered, couldn't get in open because it was too late. We got in the 10, and Luke won the 10 on that horse after he'd been riding that trailer from Springfield, Illinois down there.
Good deal. Thank you, Bob. And Lloyd, I wanted to get you to look at that photo again on the front. I know you can see it in your memory, but can you tell us a little bit of the background of that photo, please?
That picture was made by Christopher guy in Beaumont, Garth Christopher's buddy, Rolf Christopher, and that was in 1953 or 54, I guess it was. And those horses were from Grandpa Boy's breeding stock, and we always wanted to have some good riding horses. And Grandpa says he'll fix us up. Well, he fixed us up right. Most of these horses were about 14 hands high. He wanted a working horse. And that's what we had from Grandpa Boyd, and he took care of us. And then we finally Daddy got his own stallion out of Little Joe. Johnny Remke from Liberty, Texas got us lined up with him. And we called him Swift Taffy was his name. And we had 16 breed mares of ourselves. And my brother Don had more of these 4-H riders and trail riders. They came by and they were buying horses from us all the time they were so beautiful and big.
Great. Thank you, Lloyd. Thank you. And Dave, we talked about some of the freezes that had faced some of the ranchers down here, but let's talk real quickly about hurricanes and what they do with the ranching operation. if you could talk about that just a little bit.
Well, in a hurricane, you try to get out of the way, and it's pretty hard to do because the forecasting is not that accurate. But I know over in Chambers County, they move them as far north as they can, and they still lose some, but some of the good operators didn't lose near as many as some of the other ones. And as far as myself, I had some down at Freeport, and I moved them up. Didn't have any problem at all. And that's the only experience I actually had with hurricane.
And Lloyd, one more time with you, because I know you've talked about this cattle drive from Devers. Did I pronounce that right?
What from Devers?
Cottonwood.
Cottonwood. Yes, sir.
Is that it?
That was Grandpa's headquarters.
Tell us about that one.
Cottonwood was about 9 miles from Devers on 1410. The road cuts right straight through from Highway 61 going to Hancomer all the way to Stowell. And it's a big place. There's a big barn on 1410 before you get the curve down there, about 6 or 7 miles. And that was his barn for hauling hay to Bolivar. If he had a big herd down there in bad weather, that one big barn would hold 58,000 bales of hay. It had 2 floors in it. And you didn't want to have to stack that hay in there, that's for darn sure. But Cottonwood was big cattle pens, dipping vats, and everything you need. He had his own feed mill there, and it was a complete operation. And he did his own butcher and had his own generator unit there and everything, so it was complete.
Yeah, I saw all of you that have hauled hay before in your life grab your back when he said that. That's a hard deal to do. Family certainly went through a lot of these diseases and stuff with cattle and all that. You remember one you'd like to talk about that might be especially devastating to you?
Well, like when Charbonne came out. Well,
Little closer.
Huh?
Little closer.
When Charbonne came out, it was anthrax. It killed thousands of cattle on the Gulf Coast. And if you cut your hand or had a cut on your hand when you were skinning the cow, because the only thing left to make money was skinning them cattle. But if you had a cut on your hand, well, you'd get anthrax. So you'd get anthrax if you had a cut on your hand or anything. So I had a great uncle that died, Uncle Bluch, that died of anthrax. And diseases were common, but it was more the mosquitoes and the greenheads and that caused the most trouble with the cattle.
Good deal. And talk a little bit about the dipping vats, because these things came around because of the Texas fever back in the late 1800s. And for those of you that aren't familiar with that, there was a check on our cattle going north, and our cattle were mostly immune to it, but the cattle up there weren't. And
They were still dipping cattle in the 30s.
still were, yeah. And so these are strange places because sometimes you can mix the chemicals wrong and you can damage some cows, or cowboys can fall in them sometimes if they're not built right. And so, Dave, I know your family probably dipped quite a few cattle. Can you talk about that just a little bit?
Did. Most of the dipping vats and the pens were built by they call it Texas Sanitation Commission, but it's Animal Health Commission today. And they built the pens with the vats, and they were charged, which means the poison they put in them was arsenic. If anybody knows anything about arsenic, it's bad. And a lot of that stuff leached out into the ground around it and contaminated the water. And there's still some places around it that you can see the results of it. But you had to dip every 14 days. And when it was all over, there were some real good cow horses around because they got a lot of work.
All right. And how about, I'm going to throw this question to all three of you because we all have worked with notable people in the ranching industry and especially the cowboys themselves. So I'd like to ask all three of you, we'll start with Bob Kayla and move right on down. Anybody stands out in your memory that was a real good, solid coastal cowboy? Let us hear a little bit about it.
Well, my friend and cousin, Bill White, was a real horseman. He raised thousands of good horses, and he always rode a good horse. And Bill, I think of Bill every time I think about somebody raising good horses.
Okay, Dave?
I'd have to second that because I was partnered with him for 40 years, and he was a cowboy and he was a cowman.
Lloyd?
I think Johnny Remke is probably the best horseman I ever met in my life. He's lived over at Raywood for a while, but he worked cattle for Grandpa for a long time. He used to show horses. He's taken horses all the way to Madison Square Garden and won the events up there, training them, and just one of the best horse trainers in the world that I've ever met. And I think my brother would agree with him too.
And we all worked with some greats, and it's a shame all of them can't be here this evening, but they're here with us in spirit, that's for sure. So we always used to like sit around the campfire of the chuck wagon and talk about funny stories, things that we remember that are some real side busters. And I know that we have Lloyd and three brothers here tonight, and we could probably be here for 2 or 3 more days listening to their stories. But Lloyd, we'll start with you this time, going down to your end. You got any funny stories you want to give us about your ranching years?
I think one of the funniest stories that I know is we were working cows down at Bolivar, and it was in the fall, and the lake, we were hauling cows out, and Randolph Club was with us, and Vernon Freechase, and there was a cattle truck parked right there just at the end of the chute, and it's just getting dark, and Vernon's scared to death of snakes, and there was a cow whip laying on the ground, and Vernon was getting lined up ready to get out of the way so we could get the truck out of the way, and Vernon's crawling around and looking around over there, and we looked over and heard Vernon hollering. I said, "What's wrong?" And his spur had caught the whip, and he thought the snake had him down, and he was hollering for Randolph to get over here and get that snake off of him up here. So, and Randolph said, "Let him eat you up, you SOB." That was one of the best laughs we had in a long time. Vernon was scared to death.
I want to tell you one story about a man came over way before I was born and bought 300 head of brood mares from whites. They were either too old or whatever. Anyway, whites had about 700 head of brood mares running on free range in the 30s, and they had this. They had these horses, and they put them on the road at Stowell, at the White's Ranch at Stowell. They put them on the road and drove them before daylight and drove them through Beaumont and never met a car. Rode them right down Main Street in Beaumont and went on out. Then they went to Orange, and sometimes one of the old mares would play out and they'd have to leave her behind. And the guy that had bought them said, "Leave her back, we'll get them later." But they probably didn't. They probably ran off. But Grady Golden and my Goonie Mays and my Uncle Gene could nicker like a horse. You couldn't tell the difference. And they drove them all the way to Orange, left the cattle, put them in the marsh. That's where the guy was going to leave them. You know, it was free range. I don't know why he wanted 300 old brood mares, but he did. And so that was an interesting story I thought of.
Dave, you got any that we can tell?
Mine's not going to really be.
I know some we can't tell, but
about horses.
We'll keep it clean.
When I was cattle raiser, we went to Washington quite a bit, and powers that be were trying to do away with dust. And of course, up there in the Panhandle, they got dust feedlots you can't even see. But I had a friend that had a ranch at Saginaw, which is right north of Fort Worth. And so he was, I think he was the second vice president at that time, and I was president. And this guy got up and told about they're going to have these monitors around where the dust, they could tell where it comes from. And so he got up and told them, he said, "I live in Saginaw, it's roughly 10 miles from Fort Worth," and said, "We move cattle and we create quite a bit of dust, and I'd like to know what your suggestion is for doing away with it or how I control it." The guy thought a while. He was a young senator. He said, "Well, you probably need to get some water and water the watered the ground down. He said, "We don't have any water. That's why we're moving to cattle, you dumbass."
That was good. I was going to tell one, but I'm not going to try to top that. That was excellent. So, lastly, and we want to leave some room for questions, comments, and stories that y'all have too, maybe. We want to get Lloyd's brothers to incriminate him before we let him out of here. But we don't want to leave the cattle out of this because that's the industry, right? That's the backbone. I'm going to ask each of them what their favorite breed of cows were and why. And, this is a particularly tricky proposition to handle cattle on the coastal plains. It's tough, very hard, as you've heard already. So, Dave, I'm going to start with you. We'll cut down the middle this time. What's your favorite breed and why?
Well, it all depends where you are. You have to buy the cattle that fit the country. Down here, you have to have Bremer influence in your cattle, or they just don't do good. And you go further north, you can get more English, and where they do. But you have to pay attention to what kind of country you're putting them on, because that's where the difference is.
Lloyd, what was your favorite?
I have a hard time remembering what my favorite one is. I really don't know right now.
Okay. All right. Bob, you got any favorite cows?
Oh, just like that. Pick your cows for the country that you're in. If you're up North Texas, well, you need to have some English bred cattle. If you're down in South Texas, and especially around Gulf Coast, you need to have Brahma influenced cattle, Brayford cattle, or Beef Masters. Or I would help Dave Middleton work cattle, and he had Beef Masters, and they were the gentlest cattle. They looked like Brayfords, but they were so gentle, not so stirred up like some of the Brayford cows were.
And I'll tell y'all a little story real quick that most people don't know. You might be familiar with Brangus cattle, cross between a Brahma and a Angus. And way back at the turn of the century, 1900, Albert George. Anybody ever been to the George Ranch, Richmond? Okay. Albert George was a master at cattle and crossbreeding, and he actually bred the very first Brangus cattle on the George Ranch. Now, if you talk to Brangus Breeders International, they'll deny that to the hilt, but the proof is a newspaper article from Jeanerette, Louisiana, and the FDA came down, and in 1911, they started a Brangus breeding operation there, modeled after the operation on the George Ranch that Albert George started. So he had many favorites of breed, but he did a lot of work with the Brahma cattle, of course, on South Texas, and then began those crosses on those real good English bred cattle. So that's just a little tidbit most people don't know, but Albert George deserves a little credit for what he did. He was a quiet man, always stayed in the background, and his story is obscured. And it's only heard out of one or two places. And so I'm very proud to relate that story to you tonight. We wanted to leave some time for questions from y'all. Yes, ma'am. Sorry? What is my story? Well, I was hoping somebody wouldn't ask that. I actually, I had 3 or 4 parallel lives all of my life. But I started with what I loved, and that was horses when I was 8 years old. And my grandfather was one of the last of the open range cowboys. He was born in 1870. And I was fortunate enough when I was a young man to get to ride with him. And some of you might remember Playland Park. They had a ton of Shetland ponies and some little Welsh ponies. Well, they had a training operation on North Shepherd, and that was out in the country in those days. And I got a job at 8 years old, breaking and training those Shetland ponies. And by the time I was 11 years old, I was a pretty fair hand because I'd already been bit and kicked and thrown and run over and everything you can think of. But that kicked off a career training horses. And my grandfather was one of the best horse trainers that I ever worked with, not because he was my grandfather, but because he was. And so he never called it training, he called it mannering. And he told me that you always put manners on a horse first. Training comes last. You want him to be mannered. And so as a result, if you see one of my horses today, you'll see the reflection of my grandfather in him. Because when I throw that rein on the ground, you could leave and come back tomorrow, he'll still be there. You don't tie my horses up, ever. You just throw the rein on the ground. And I neck rope them. So I go out, I don't have to. They're walking towards me, but I rope them anyway. Kind of just an old way of keeping that relationship alive. So thanks for that question. That was great. And I trained some mighty good horses in my life. I really did. Yes, sir.
Thanks, guys, for being here. First, I want to make an observation about Brother Bob here on the end. Were you the stand-in or the stunt man for Robert Duvall when they made the Lonesome Duvall? Now, you guys were talking about your favorite cattle. Tell us about what type of horse was best for the job you were doing, herding those cattle.
Well, we talked about the American quarter horse. I think they've proven themselves as being one of the best cow horses. You can breed them up. You can breed them down. You can breed them short and tall and heavy and big boned and fine boned. So they're good, versatile horses. And for those of you that don't know, the American quarter horse is a combination of almost every horse breed in the world. So that's why they're so good. You get a little bit of everything all in one package. So everybody agree with that? Bob?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, okay. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am. Oh, well, you got my book. Thank you. Yeah, so I wrote a little book called Texas Longhorns, a short essay back in 1998. And a friend of mine provoked me to turn it into a little book. And it's actually just a series of essays. It's not really a book, I don't think. Not like Bob. Bob writes real books. I just play at it. But the Longhorns, of course, in the book, we take the modern day genetics, and what we suspected all along is they were from the Middle East. And that was confirmed by DNA. And so somehow through nature, as they rotated, all these conquering nations around Persia and the Middle East traded these cattle. When they wound up in Spain, something very special happened, and the Spanish learned from the Moors of North Africa what the ancient Egyptians already knew, and that is how to crossbreed and raise better cattle. And we do that the same way today. As a matter of fact, 6,000 years ago. And so Hernan Cortez came to the Americas in 1519 with the first load of cattle ever. And he unloaded them around Saltillo, Mexico, and started the first cattle ranch in the Western Hemisphere known as the Three Latin Crosses. That was the first brand ever in the Western Hemisphere. And through a process of either God or nature or Hernan Cortez being a pretty sharp fellow, whatever you want to believe. In 1619, for the very first time, these etchings on the cave dwellings from Native Americans were found, showing that the Longhorns had finally worked their way up here to what we know as Texas today. So it's a remarkable story, again, that nobody's ever heard, but it's all there in the science if you want to look at it. And they were a very valuable breed during the post-Civil War era especially. And later on became pretty valuable when they crossbred them with European cattle, make better beef and add some fat to them. So thanks for asking that. I appreciate that. Yes, Marie? Yeah, the question was that some people had removed the Longhorns from their pastures. And the question was why? And I know your grandfather, Boyd, played a big role in that, right?
I tell you, the longhorn is one of the most dangerous animals. And I learned this from Jim. What he told me about the most dangerous animal in the world is a mama longhorn with a baby. And you try to get to that baby. But Grandpa Boyd joined in 1925. He wanted to help get rid of the longhorn cattle over here because you needed to get the longhorns out so you get a better breeding, more meat animal. And in 1925, Grandpa got together with Santa Fe Railroad in Jefferson County, and 15 miles out of Beaumont, Grandpa Boyd, they spent $10,000 and they built a special set of pens. And they built those pens to ship longhorn cattle out of here. The farmers or the ranchers would bring the cows up to that set of pens, and there was another set of pens built 10 miles away from there. But the first load of longhorns that came in there came in from Monroe White, and he brought in a herd of 700 cows, 700 longhorns, 50 miles to the set of pens, which is on 124 out of Beaumont, about 10, 15 miles. And it's right Boyd Road where Grandpa Boyd lives. And they had a set of dipping vats. They had dipping vats in there, and they called them the big bore dipping vats, so they wouldn't catch the horns of the longhorn cattle when they were dipping. And they had to dip those cattle 3 times, and then they had a cattle inspector that checked them out before they load them on a train to ship them out. And these pens cost about $10,000 to build, but they worked so good. And the deal that was made was that they had to do a train load a day when they were processing the animals. And there was between that one place, the first week they loaded cows out, they loaded out 1 complete train load. And in 2 weeks' time, they had 7 or 9 train loads that went to Kansas. And the most cattle that were shipped out, the longhorns, that were shipped out between the 2 sets of cattle pens was 26 train loads in 1 month of longhorn cattle to Kansas. And that really, and they said that what Monroe White did, he scoured about 50,000 acres of ground looking to see if there was 1 cow left. He didn't want a longhorn on his place.
All right. Yes, ma'am.
What difference did the stockyards make to cattlemen in the early 30s and then the rodeo?
J.W. Sartwell from Palacios, Texas, came to Houston. He was he got a law degree, and he was a very farsighted man. And he contacted my grandfather, who was up and doing pretty well at that time. He'd been broke a couple of times, but he was in real good financial shape, and told him that we needed a stockyard in Houston, Texas. That the only 2 stockyards was Fort Worth and San Antonio. And even then, a lot of the cattle were going to New Orleans because they all went by rail pretty well. So they solicited some stockholders. Monroe White was one, Kraut Barber, one of the boys, I guess Mr. Elmer. Anyhow, more Chambers County people bought stock than any other place. And they built the stockyards, and it opened in 1931. Well, most of the cattle that came when it opened, there was a few local, but there wasn't any roads around here that, were cattle hauling. And most of the cattle came in on rail, and Houston had always been, they had a little pen there, feed, water, and rest on the way to New Orleans. And if you build I'm getting ahead of myself. Anyhow, they started when they stopped for water and rest. They would get a couple of buyers come out there, and then they'd call the shipper and say, "Hey, we got so much bid on these cattle right here. You want to sell them?" So that's kind of how the market got going. And then the railroad made a concession that they called it their privilege of the market. That's what it was, the privilege of the market. In other words, they could build the cattle to New Orleans, but if they stopped in Houston and sold them, they weren't charged for the rest of the way, which they otherwise would have been. And that's really when the cattle started coming to Houston. And from then on and then into the late 30s, early 40s, where Houston was number one calf market in the United States.
All right. Well, unfortunately, I'm watching my clock here, and we're running close to being out of time. And that's a shame because I feel a little selfish being able to sit up here and share the stage with these three guys. They're just icons. No way you can get around that. So if y'all will give them a big round of applause, I would sure appreciate that.